My own son sat in my living room and asked me to buy another woman's body like he was handing me a grocery list. He did not whisper it. He did not look embarrassed. He said it in the same tone people use when they believe the answer is already yes, and that was the part that turned my stomach before anything else did. Siobhan sat beside him on my cream sofa with one leg crossed over the other, her purse balanced neat on her lap, her face set in that careful expression women wear when they plan to let a man do the ugly part for them. I had invited them in for coffee. Instead, Corey leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and started talking about image, confidence, opportunities. He said the surgery would help her brand, help her online presence, help them move differently in certain rooms. He spoke like he was pitching a business expense instead of asking his mother to fund a BBL. Not a loan, not temporary help. Pay for it, cover it fully, do this for us. That was the shape of his voice. By then, the coffee between us had gone untouched. My name is Dorinda Briggs, and I have lived long enough to know when a conversation is pretending to be something it is not. I raised my son to look people in the eye. I taught him that you do not reach into somebody else's pocket with a smile and call it love. So as he sat there in my house, speaking like access was inheritance and inheritance was entitlement, I felt something old and tired in me go still. He kept talking. He reminded me about the car note I once helped with, the rent gap years ago, the time I stepped in when life had backed him into a corner and he needed help faster than pride would let him ask for it properly. He laid those moments out one by one like receipts for a debt I owed him. Siobhan still barely spoke, but every now and then she added a soft little sentence dressed up as reason. "It's not even about vanity," she said. "It's really about positioning." Positioning. I looked at her, then back at my son, and for a second I thought about how often disrespect enters a room wearing polished language. "Since you're here with me, tell me what time you're watching from. I always like knowing when a story finds somebody." Then I folded my hands in my lap and gave him the only answer he should have needed. No. It landed plain between us. Corey blinked once like he had misheard me. "No? I will not pay for elective cosmetic surgery," I said. "I have helped in emergencies. I have helped when life turned hard. I am not financing this." The room changed after that. Not loudly, quietly. That was what made it worse. His face did not twist right away. It settled, like something beneath it had finally stopped pretending. He leaned back and looked at me with a kind of disbelief that felt uglier than shouting. Siobhan looked down at her nails. Corey let out a short laugh with no humor in it. "So that's what this is." "That is what it is," I said. He stood up slowly. "After everything, you're really going to do this?" I stayed seated. I already did. His jaw tightened. He looked at me the way people look at locked doors. Then he said, very calm, very cold, "If you won't do this for my wife, then maybe you don't need a son anymore." I held his gaze and felt the last warm piece of that afternoon leave the room. "No," I said again, softer this time. Something in him hardened right in front of me, and that was when I understood he had not come to ask me for anything at all. He had come to punish me. Disrespect gets reckless the moment it realizes guilt is not going to open the door. Corey did not leave after I told him no the second time. He stood there in the middle of my living room with his shoulders tight and his mouth set in a hard line, like he was still waiting for the version of me that used to soften first and think later. When that woman did not appear for him, his voice changed. It lifted, not to a scream at first, just enough to let me know he had stopped trying to sound like somebody worth reasoning with. "So that's it," he said. "You can help when it makes you feel generous, but the second it's something you don't approve of, now you have principles." I said nothing. That seemed to offend him even more than refusal. He started pulling old help out of the air and slamming it down between us like evidence. The car note, the rent gap, money I had covered during one bad year when everything in his life seemed to come due at once. He twisted every act of support into proof that I had always come through before, as if generosity was a legal pattern I was now breaking without notice. "You never had a problem stepping in when you wanted to," he said. "You like being needed. That's what this is. Control. Siobhan shifted on the sofa and finally opened her mouth. Her voice came out smooth and low, the kind that tries to pass for harmless because it is not loud. A lot of older women do this, she said. They act like younger women making choices for themselves is some kind of moral failure. I turned and looked at her properly then. She held my eyes for half a second, then reached for her bag strap and adjusted it, delicate and calm, like she had not just dropped something ugly into my house. Corey took my silence as permission to go further. If you can keep pouring money into property, investments, church donations, all that image stuff you care about, then don't sit here acting broke when it comes to family. That was when I noticed the small green light near the front hallway camera, still on, and beyond the open arch near the side entrance, I caught the faint movement of the house manager's sleeve. He had come in earlier with parcels and had not fully gone back out yet. He was close enough to hear tones, maybe words, close enough to exist inside the moment whether Corey realized it or not. So I let my son keep talking. Every sentence made him looser, meaner, less careful. He took another step toward me, not enough to touch, just enough to make the room smaller. He was no longer arguing for money. He was performing resentment that had been waiting much longer than today. Then I gave him one sentence. Just one. A grown man should not need to threaten his mother over another grown adult's body. His face changed so fast it almost looked like pain. Threaten? He snapped. You are unbelievable. Then the words started coming hot and fast. Selfish, bitter, useless. He said I wanted people beneath me. Said I acted holy because I had money. Said I judged Siobhan because nobody was checking for me anymore. That one was hers, not his. I could hear it in the wording. He stepped closer. I stayed where I was. For 1 second, all I could hear was the clock on the far wall. Then Corey drew back his face and spat on me. It landed warm across my cheek. Siobhan stood up so fast her purse slid off her lap. Her eyes widened, not in innocence, not in outrage exactly, but in the startled recognition that something had happened which could not be tidied later with explanation. Still, she followed him. Of course she did. She hurried after him in sharp little steps, heels catching once on the foyer rug before the front door jerked open and slammed hard enough to shake the frame. Silence rushed in behind them. A moment later, the house manager stepped out from the side hall looking stunned, one hand still half raised like he had forgotten what he meant to do with it. I reached for the napkin beside my cold coffee, wiped my cheek once, and set the napkin down. I did not cry. I smiled. Not because I enjoyed any part of it, because something I had been waiting to know had finally told me the truth. The house went so quiet after the door slammed that I could hear the hum of my refrigerator from the other end of the hall. That kind of silence can break some women. It can make them reach for the nearest phone and call a cousin, a sister, a friend from church. Anybody willing to sit on the line and say the kind of comforting things people offer when they do not know what else to do. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of that option press in on me. Then I let it pass. Comfort can be expensive when it arrives too early. It can soften a decision that needs to stay hard. So I did not call family. I did not call anybody who loved me enough to ask how I felt before asking what happened. I went upstairs. I changed my blouse first. I was not going to sit in my study wearing what my son had spit on. I washed my face slowly at the bathroom sink, not scrubbing, not shaking, just letting the water run cool over my skin until the last physical trace of him went down the drain. For a second, just a second, my hand stayed on the edge of the sink. Not trembling. Just still. There are moments when something in you wants to break, not loudly, but in a quiet way that asks for permission. I felt it there, waiting. I did not give it permission. I dried my face, straightened my shoulders in the mirror, and walked down the short hall into the room where I keep my papers, my checkbooks, my school plaques, and the framed photograph of the life I used to think discipline could protect. I sat behind my desk and looked at my phone. I did not pick it up right away. Instead, my eyes moved to the top drawer. The folder was still there. It had been sitting there for weeks, quiet, unfinished, something I had opened once or twice and then closed again because I kept telling myself I was being dramatic, that I was reading too much into small things, that my son was just under pressure, that marriage changes people, that life gets complicated. I had been giving him explanations. Standing there in that silence, I realized something simple and ugly. He had stopped giving me reasons. That was the shift. I reached for the phone and called Selena Boone. She answered on the second ring. "Talk to me," she said. There was no pity in her voice. That was one of the reasons I trusted her. Pity always arrives before strategy and gets in the way of it. "He came with his wife," I said. "He demanded that I pay for her surgery." I said no. He threatened to cut ties. He raised his voice. He called me selfish, bitter, and useless. I paused. Then I said it plain. He spat on me before he left. I heard paper shift on her end. "Anybody present?" The house manager was near the side entrance with parcels. The front hallway camera was on. She was quiet for half a breath, not shocked, measuring. "Did you respond?" I said very little. "That's good." I leaned back in my chair and looked toward the dark window over the bookshelf. My reflection sat there looking older than it had that morning, but steadier too. For months, I had been noticing things I did not want to name. The way Corey spoke when he needed something. The way requests stopped sounding like requests and started sounding like expectations. The way help turned into something he counted on instead of something he appreciated. I had mentioned it to Selena before. Not like this. Not with certainty. More like a woman testing her own instincts out loud, hoping somebody would tell her she was overthinking. Selena never told me that. She told me to pay attention. And if I was going to do anything about it, she told me something else too. Suspicion is not enough, she had said. You need clarity. You need pattern. And if it ever comes to action, you need proof that stands without emotion. I had not been ready then. Sitting there now, I was. "This was not just an argument," I said slowly. "This was pressure. It's been building. I just didn't want to see it." Selena did not rush me. "That happens," she said. "What matters is what you do with it now." I opened the top drawer and rested my fingers on the edge of the folder. For the first time, I did not hesitate. "We're past watching," I said. "I'm ready to move." That was enough for her. "We can start in the morning," she said. "The witness statement needs to be taken while it's fresh. Save the camera footage tonight. Do not contact him. Do not answer if he starts calling. He will call," I said. "I know." Her certainty settled something in me. I closed the drawer gently. Not out of fear. Out of finality. "File what needs to be filed," I said. "Let's do this properly." I ended the call before either of us said goodbye. For a moment, I sat there in the quiet and let the weight of what I had just stepped into settle around me. It was not revenge. It did not feel like victory. It felt like a door closing that I had spent too many years pretending was still open. The next move was not going to be emotional. It was going to be necessary. My son probably went out to dinner that night thinking he had made a point. I went to my record for remembers longer than feelings do. The first document I touched was the emergency rent payment. I did not need to read it to remember it. Corey had called me from a parking lot. His voice had that tight edge to it, pride still standing, but barely. Payroll delay, late fees stacking, one problem feeding the next. I remember how fast I moved. Not because I had thought it through, because he sounded just ashamed enough to make urgency feel like the right response. Back then, help still sounded like help. He thanked me 3 times that week. I set the paper down. Then I reached for the next file. The vehicle. I had co-signed because his rate was high and his credit was weaker than he admitted. He promised he would refinance in 6 months. 6 months became 11. 11 became me calling him twice before he handled it. I remembered that call too. The way I softened my voice before asking. The way he sounded slightly irritated, like I had interrupted something more important than keeping his word. I told myself he was overwhelmed, that he was learning. That is how mothers translate disappointment into something we can continue to support. I moved on. The short-term boost. That one stayed sharper. He had come to me with a business idea, confident, polished, full of language but empty where it mattered. He said he just needed a push. I asked him one question. What happens after that? There was a pause. Then more confidence. More talking. No structure. I wrote the transfer anyway. And I watched that idea disappear into the quiet place where unserious things go. No launch. No follow-up. No repayment. Just space. Until the next need arrived wearing a different explanation. I did not stop there. The legal fee. The insurance gap when his child was born, his voice caught between panic and irritation that life had become expensive at the wrong time. Then the down payment. That one stayed with me longer than the others. Not because I regretted it, because of how quickly gratitude moved through him. I remembered standing in that house, keys in his hand, watching relief settle into him like something permanent. Appreciation didn't stay that long. I sat back slightly and looked at everything spread across my desk. That was when it shifted. Not loudly. Not all at once. Just enough to stop pretending I hadn't already seen it. This was not a series of moments. It was a pattern. The first time, there had been gratitude. The second, relief. By the third, something quieter had taken its place. Expectation. I did not soften that word. I let it sit exactly where it belonged. Because once I said it clearly, everything behind it arranged itself. If I stepped in once, it became precedent. If I stepped in twice, it became character. And somewhere along the way, he stopped hearing help when I gave it. He started hearing access. Something available. Something he could return to. I rested my hands on the desk and let that settle fully. Because the hardest truth was not what Corey had become. It was how long I had been helping him become it. Siobhan did not build that in him. She recognized it, refined it, gave it language that sounded like ambition instead of dependence. But she stepped into something that was already there, and I had helped build it. That realization did not make me angry. It made everything still. There is a difference between loving your child and financing the worst parts of what they are becoming. I had crossed that line long before that afternoon in my living room. I just kept renaming it so I could live with it. Near midnight, I opened one of the older email chains tied to a larger transfer. I scrolled lower than I had before. I almost stopped. Then I didn't. There it was. Short. Plain. Easy to overlook if you were not ready to hold it properly. I know I owe you back for that money. Just give me a little time. I read it once. Then again. Slower. Not because it was powerful. Because it was honest. He had named it himself. I leaned back in my chair and let the paper rest in my hands. That was the moment everything stopped being separate. The rent. The car. The business idea. The house. The emergencies. The silence that followed each one. It wasn't help anymore. It was a structure. And I had been the one holding it up. For the first time that night, I understood something clearly enough that it did not need explanation. If I didn't change it, nothing else ever would. The next morning, I drove to the cemetery before the city had fully made up its mind to be awake. There was still dew on the grass when I stepped out of the car. The air held that early quiet that makes every small sound feel louder than it is. My heels sank slightly into the ground as I walked toward my husband's stone. Halfway there, I almost stopped. Not because I did not want to be there, because I knew what I was about to settle. By the time I reached him, I already understood something clearly. I was not there to cry. I was there to separate things that had been sitting too close together for too long. Grief and confusion. I looked down at his name and felt the old ache move through me. Steady and familiar. Raymond, I said softly. My voice sounded smaller out there than it did in my house. He had not been a dramatic man. He did not believe in long speeches when a sentence would do. He did not confuse love with looseness either. There were things he used to say so often they had settled into the walls of our marriage, quiet rules, tucked into ordinary days. One of them came back to me right there, standing between the trimmed hedges and clean rows of stone. It was what sat hardest in my chest. This was not new. Corey had not changed overnight. He had been showing me himself in pieces for years, and I had kept renaming those pieces into something easier to live with. Stress, pressure, marriage, bad timing, ambition, growing pains. I had taken something clear and softened it until it fit inside love. I closed my eyes for a second, and for that second, I let myself feel it properly. Not just what he had become, what I had allowed. That was the part that stayed longer than I expected. When I opened my eyes again, I did not rush the next thought. I stood there quietly, letting it settle into something I could actually stand on. What I was about to do did not feel clean. It felt necessary. That difference matters. "This isn't revenge," I said under my breath. The words did not echo. They did not need to. Revenge would have been louder, faster, built on hurt. This was slower than that, heavier. I was not trying to destroy my son. I was trying to stop being the open gate his worst instincts kept walking through. I still loved him. That had not changed. But love and access are not the same thing. And I had spent too many years behaving like they were. I looked down at Raymond's name one more time. "If I leave this loose," I said quietly, "I'm not helping him." The wind shifted slightly, just enough to move the leaves along the edge of the path. I'm helping him stay the same. That was the decision. Not sudden. Not dramatic. Just settled. I stood there another minute, then turned and walked back to my car. This time, I did not hesitate. I did not go home first. I drove straight to Selena Boone's office downtown, parked in the visitor lot, and rode the elevator up without once checking my phone. That was intentional. If Corey had called, I was not ready to hear his voice yet. Selena's receptionist looked up when I stepped in and gave me a quiet, professional smile, the kind people wear when they already understand you are there for something that will not be undone easily. Selena was waiting for me. Legal pad open. 2 folders on the table. Glasses low on her nose. She did not ask whether I was sure. She looked at me once, then asked the only question that mattered. "Where do you want to begin?" I sat down. For a brief moment, my hands rested on the edge of the table without moving. Then I pulled the first folder toward me. "Structure," I said. That was where we started. Estate plan revisions. Beneficiary changes, property control, access instructions, paper by paper, line by line, signature by signature. I felt something inside me shift, not relief, not satisfaction, something steadier, like a door closing properly for the first time in years. There was no triumph in it, only order. When the last page of that first stack was signed, Selena gathered the documents neatly and said, "I'll start the notifications where needed." "No," I said. She looked up. "Not yet." I held her eyes, aware of how different my voice sounded now. Not louder. Just decided. He must believe everything is still open. Real power does not arrive with raised voices. It arrives in initials at the bottom of pages people never think to fear until it is too late. By Thursday, Selena's office had started to feel less like a law firm and more like a place where things were being corrected. Not quickly, not perfectly, but steadily. I sat across from her conference table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold once, then twice, and watched my life shift in ways that did not show on the surface. That is the cleanest way I can say it. Nothing disappeared. Nothing was hidden. What belonged to me stayed mine. What needed protection was simply moved out of reach of assumption. Still, The process did not feel as clean as it looked. There were moments where my pen hovered longer than it should have, moments where I reread a line not because I did not understand it, but because I understood it too well. One property had still been sitting in my individual name longer than it should have been. "That one needs to move," Selena said. I nodded, but I did not sign right away. I ran my finger once along the edge of the paper. That property had held years in it. Memories, decisions, time. For a second, I felt the old instinct rise, the one that tells you to leave things as they are because they have always been that way. Selena did not rush me. She waited. That was something I had come to respect about her. When I signed, it was slower than I expected. Deliberate, not emotional. Just final. We moved on. A business interest Raymond had once kept simple because he trusted family more than paperwork was tightened under stricter terms. Account designations were reviewed one by one. Access permissions that had lived too long on convenience were narrowed down to what was actually necessary. Some people would call those small things, administrative things. But that is where carelessness hides best, in the quiet spaces nobody revisits because they believe love will hold what structure was meant to protect. Selena did not talk to me like I was under attack. She talked to me like I was late. That difference stayed with me. "This part is straightforward," she said, sliding another document toward me. "You are not taking anything from anybody. You are clarifying what was always yours to control." I looked at her for a second before signing. Not because I doubted her, because I was adjusting to hearing it that way. Clarifying, not cutting off, not words settled deeper than reassurance would have. Appropriate, not emotional, not excessive. Necessary. I nodded once and kept going, because the truth was, what I was correcting had been building for years. Then Selena shifted the conversation. "Now the history," she said. That file sat thicker than the others. Not louder, not more dramatic. Just heavier. Transfers, cashier's checks, emails, dates, reasons, follow-ups, and in many cases, the absence of them. We were careful there. That was one thing I trusted about Selena. She had no interest in building something larger than the truth. "We should not pretend every dollar was a loan," she said. "I know. We show the pattern instead. Dependency, expectation, pressure. And where he gave written acknowledgement, we isolate that." That made sense. More than sense. It felt clean. A false debt would have looked like anger. Pattern looked like truth. So we separated one especially large advance, the one he had once referred to, in his own words, as something he owed back. Not formally, not structured, just plainly enough to matter. The rest stayed what they had always been. Support, context, a trail of what he had grown used to receiving and how he had learned to speak about it. By the end of the week, most of what needed to hold held. Not everything. Some confirmations were still pending. A few adjustments had not fully reflected yet. But enough had settled. Enough to change the shape of things. The part that stayed with me most was how ordinary everything still looked. My car sat in the driveway. My curtains opened onto the same street. Nothing about the outside had shifted. If Corey had driven by, he would have seen the same house. The same porch. The same quiet, the same access, or what he believed was access. That was the point. I sat back in my chair and looked at the final stack of documents resting between us. From the outside, my life had not changed. Inside it, everything had. And he had no idea it no longer worked the way he thought it did. The hardest part was not saying no. It was answering the phone afterward like I still lived inside the old arrangement. Corey called 3 days later, right around noon, while I was at the kitchen counter slicing oranges into a glass bowl. His name lit up my screen like nothing had happened, like my cheek had not gone hot under his spit, like the last thing he had left in my house was not the sound of a door slamming hard enough to shake the frame. I let it ring twice before picking up. "Hey, Ma." His voice came easy. Too easy. Not warm. Not sorry. Just careful in the way people get when they are testing whether a boundary is held. "Corey." A short pause. Then he laughed lightly, like we had both agreed to pretend our way past what he had done. "You okay?" I put the knife down and reached for a napkin. "I'm fine." That was all he needed to hear. He did not apologize. He did not mention the argument. He did not ask whether he had crossed a line, because men like that only ask questions when they think the answer can still be managed. Instead, he started circling the edges of ordinary conversation, work, traffic, a cousin I had not seen in months. Then, once he felt the temperature had lowered enough, he moved closer to what he really wanted. "You still been putting off all that paperwork stuff?" he asked. "You always say you're going to organize everything, and then never get around to it." I let a soft breath pass like I had not noticed the bait. "I still haven't updated all that paperwork," I said. "I've been meaning to organize the estate properly, but I just haven't gotten around to it." He was quiet for half a beat, and in that quiet I could almost hear his confidence returning. "That sounds like you," he said. I smiled to myself, though there was no pleasure in it, only precision. That became the rhythm over the next week. He called. I answered. He probed. I gave him just enough softness to let him mistake my calm for forgetfulness. I never brought up Selena. Never brought up the camera. Never forced him to revisit the worst thing he had done. Silence did the work better than accusation ever could. Because I was not screaming, he took that to mean I had gone back to being manageable. He began speaking in future tense again. Not directly at first. Little things. Comments about where we might be this time next year. A joke about outgrowing their current place. A line about how some families move smarter because they keep assets close instead of letting things get tied up. Once, when he thought he was being subtle, he said, "At the end of the day, family property should stay in family hands." I wrote every line down after we got off the phone. Dates, time, tone. Exact phrasing where I could remember it cleanly. I kept the notebook in the top drawer beside my pen tray and added to it after each exchange. Selena told me not to guide him, not to ask leading questions. Just let him reveal his own assumptions in his own language. It is amazing what people will volunteer once they believe the room is safe again. The boldness grew the way mold does, quiet, ugly, certain. One evening, I overheard enough through a half-muted speaker call to know he had told Siobhan not to worry. Another day, somebody in the background laughed after he called me dramatic but predictable, and he did not bother lowering his voice before saying it. That one sat with me longer than it should have. Not because it hurt, because it told the truth about what he thought calm women were. That night, after sunset, my phone buzzed while I was in bed reading. A text from Corey. I opened it and felt something inside me turn cold in the cleanest way. "You know, I'm your only son. One way or another, all this comes to me anyway." I read it once. Then I took a screenshot, forwarded dramatically, not to overwhelm me, just precise. Statements clipped clean. Transfers stacked in order. Emails printed. Messages highlighted. A yellow legal pad with dates running down the margin, like a quiet timeline of decisions I had made without realizing what they were becoming. She handed me coffee. Then she slid the first stack forward. "Today we narrow," she said. Not build. Not expand. Narrow. I understood immediately what that meant. Not everything belonged in what we were doing. That was the discipline. For a moment, my hands stayed still, because what sat in front of me wasn't just money. It was memory with numbers attached to it. Then I reached forward. That was the line. "We're not turning everything into a debt," I said. Selena didn't look up right away. "Good," she said, "because it isn't." That steadied something in me. We were not there to punish him for disappointing me. We were there to separate what could stand from what could be argued away. So we divided it. Cleanly. Gifts stayed gifts. Emergency help stayed what it was: response, not obligation. That part mattered more than anything else. Because once you blur that line, everything starts to look like anger instead of truth. Selena marked entries quietly as we moved. "This was support," she said once. "This was voluntary. This has no written follow-up." Each category tightened the story without raising its voice. Then we shifted. "What about this one?" she asked, tapping a larger transfer. I looked at it longer. That one carried more than money. It carried assumption. "He said he would pay it back," I said. Selena didn't respond to the feeling in that sentence. She responded to the structure. "Did he say it in writing?" I nodded slowly. That was the difference. Not what I remembered. What could be shown? She pulled the email forward. I leaned in. I had seen it before, but I had never read it this way. "Once things settle, I'll start paying you back in pieces." That was all it took. No contract. No legal language. Just his own words, placed plainly in a moment he thought would pass. I sat there a second longer than I expected to, because recognition does not arrive loudly. It lands quietly and stays. "He never followed through," I said. Selena nodded once. "He didn't need to." I looked at her. "The statement stands," she added. That was the shift. Not memory. Record. Memory explains. Record defines. From that point forward, the work changed. We were no longer reviewing history. We were selecting what could hold under pressure. Everything else stepped back. Not erased. Not ignored. Just repositioned. Context. That discipline changed how I saw everything. The rent payment wasn't part of the claim. The car wasn't either. The business money didn't belong there. Those were part of the pattern, but not the argument. And that difference made the file stronger, not weaker. By the time we moved through the second stack, something else became clear. Corey had not just accepted help over the years. He had reorganized himself around it. Not consciously. That would have been easier to confront. This was quieter than that. He adjusted. The first time, he asked. The second time, he expected. By the later years, he assumed. I did not say that out loud this time. I didn't need to. Selena already worked like someone who understood patterns without needing them explained. She tapped another document lightly. "We only take what can stand on its own," she said. That sentence stayed with me, because it removed something I didn't realize I was still holding. Emotion. Not my love for him. That was still there. But the need to justify what I was doing. By late afternoon, the file in front of us had changed. Not in size. In precision. What remained was smaller than what I brought in. But heavier, tighter, harder to challenge. I reached out and aligned the edges of the stack with my hand. It felt finished in a way the earlier version never could have been. Not complete, but contained. That was the difference. I sat back and let that settle fully, because the truth was no longer spread across years of decisions. It had been reduced to something simple enough to hold without explanation. Corey had not just relied on my help, he had built his expectations on it. And for the first time, I was looking at that structure without trying to protect it. By then, most of what mattered was in place. Not everything. That part matters. Some confirmations were still pending. One account adjustment had not fully reflected yet. A document Selena expected midweek did not come until Friday. Small things, administrative things. But enough had settled to change the shape of what came next. The paperwork had been tightened. The account permissions were no longer loose. The reimbursement file had weight. The witness was real. The camera footage had been preserved. Selena had what she needed. I had what I needed. And still, I waited. That part would sound strange to people who think consequence should arrive hot, immediate, loud, like something breaking in real time. But I had no interest in doing anything from the same emotional place Corey had lived in his whole life. Hurt makes sloppy decisions when it wants relief more than result. I did not want relief. I wanted timing that could not be undone. The last conversation between us had ended gently instead of slamming the walls of my house. I let him speak. He asked whether he could mention my name in a financing conversation, said it might help move things along. No, I said. A pause. Then a small laugh. You're still in one of your moods, he said lightly. Not angry. Not aggressive. Just dismissive. Like nothing permanent had happened. Like I was something that would reset if he waited me out long enough. That was new. Before, he had pushed. Now, he was circling. A few days after that, he called again. The conversation stayed shallow, almost careful, until the end. As he pulled the phone away, not realizing I could still hear him clearly, his voice dropped just enough to reveal what sat underneath all of it. You'll come around eventually. The line stayed with me longer than the rest, not because it hurt, because it explained him. That was when I understood the full poverty of his thinking. Corey did not believe he had crossed a moral line. He believed he had simply miscalculated pressure. Too fast. Too sharp. Not too wrong. I wrote that down after the call. Selena told me to. Don't guide him, she had said. Let him speak in his own language. So I let him. And every time he did, the file grew stronger without me adding anything to it. Still, there were delays. That is the part people do not talk about when they imagine this kind of process. Things take time. Banks confirm slowly. Institutions move carefully. Paperwork sits in systems longer than it should. One afternoon, I called Selena to ask whether something should have come through already. It's moving, she said, just not as fast as you want. I exhaled. I don't want to move too early. Then don't, she said. Let the structure finish holding. So I let it hold. In the meantime, the parts of the story that did not belong to feeling kept strengthening. The house manager came in one morning and gave his statement. He did not exaggerate. He did not dramatize. He said what he heard, what he saw, and where he stood. Nothing more. That mattered to me. The footage held in the same way. Not perfect. Not cinematic. But honest. It showed enough the timing, the movement, the distance closing between us, the way Corey approached, the way he left, the way I stayed. Not everything. Enough. That is the difference between fantasy and evidence. By the end of that week, I had something I had not had before. Not certainty. I had that already. I had support. Protected assets, corrected access, documented history, written assumptions, a witness, preserved footage, and a pattern that had continued even after the worst moment had already passed. That part mattered most. Then, late one evening, my phone buzzed. Another message from Corey. I opened it. Read it once. Then again. I hope you're not doing anything stupid over this. I sat there for a long moment with the phone in my hand, not reacting, not rushing, just letting the sentence settle into what it actually was. Not concern, not confusion, control, still trying to speak. I took a screenshot, forwarded it to Selena. Then I called her. When she answered, I did not explain. I did not revisit anything. I did not need to. Send it, I said. The ugliest moments in a family are often carried later by whoever was never meant to see them. By the time the house manager sat across from Selena Boone, the confrontation in my foyer had already begun changing shape in my own mind. That is what memory does when pain gets inside it. It sharpens one detail, blurs another, protects you where it can, betrays you where it wants to. I remembered Corey's face clearly. I remembered the wet shock of what he did. I remembered Siobhan's quick little steps behind him when he stormed out. But memory, for all its force, is still personal. Personal things are easy for shameless people to challenge. Witnesses are harder. The house manager did not come into Selena's office trying to help me win anything. That mattered. He came looking uncomfortable, hat in hand, shoulders stiff, like a man who would have preferred never to be part of a private family fracture at all. Selena offered him water. He thanked her twice before sitting down. Then she asked him to say only what he knew for certain. So he did. He said he had entered through the side corridor with parcels and was on his way back out when he heard Corey's voice rise, not from the beginning. That part mattered, because truth sounds stronger when it admits where it starts. He had not caught the first soft stage of the conversation. What he heard first was anger already climbing. He paused because he heard the word pay, then something about wife, then Corey's voice getting sharper when I refused him. He said he stepped just far enough to see into the foyer through the open arch. From there, he saw my son take a step closer to me. He heard Corey say that if I would not do this, maybe I did not need a son at all. He heard my refusal. He heard my voice stay low. Then he heard me say something about a grown man threatening his mother over another grown adult's body. After that, he said, everything changed quickly. Corey moved with a kind of angry force that made the whole moment feel unstable. He called me names: bitter, selfish, useless. The house manager said he froze because he could feel the line being crossed before he understood exactly how far it would go. Then he saw Corey spit on me. There was no confusion in that part of his statement, no guessing, no polite uncertainty. He saw it, clear and direct, the humiliation, the exit, conduct, not interpretation. The camera footage helped the same way. It was not some flawless recording with every syllable clear and every face turned just right for judgment. What it gave us was timing, movement, pace, aggression, aftermath. Corey entering with confidence, Corey advancing toward me, Siobhan rushing out behind him, me remaining in place after the violence of the moment had already moved on. The hallway audio picked up enough of the volume and enough of the break in tone to support what the witness described. Not perfect, strong. Selena told me later that men like Corey often survive on ambiguity. They rely on people saying, maybe it was just a bad argument. Maybe she is sensitive. Maybe everybody is upset. Maybe it sounds worse, retold. They count on there being no clean line between disrespect and consequence. The witness closed that line. By late afternoon, the statement had been signed, notarized, and attached. Selena slid the final packet into the certified envelope, pressed it flat with her palm, and addressed it in one smooth motion. From that point on, the story was no longer sitting inside family feeling. It belonged to formal consequence. The envelope reached him on an ordinary afternoon, and that was part of what made it hit so hard. There was no storm outside, no dramatic music in the background of his life, no warning that the day was about to divide itself into before and after. Corey signed for it the way men sign for harmless things all the time, half looking, half distracted, probably expecting some emotional mess he could scoff at later. A guilt letter, maybe. A mother's wounded speech dressed up as boundaries. Some dramatic threat about a will that he could wave off, call excessive, and use as proof that I was overreacting. What he got instead was Selena Boone. Not her face, not her voice, her order. The first page was clean, firm, dated, every line arranged with the kind of restraint that gives panic nowhere soft to land. No insults, no pleading, no swollen language reaching for revenge. Just sections, headings, plain statements that did not need his agreement in order to remain true. He read that prior assumptions regarding future discretionary support, access, and informal influence were no longer valid. He read that relevant estate planning instruments and related control structures had been reviewed and revised. He read that he was to preserve all communications related to his mother's finances, property, and decision-making. He read that certain reimbursable amounts, supported by prior written acknowledgments, were now formally on notice. He read that any attempt to interfere with, intimidate, pressure, or misrepresent his mother in relation to her assets or choices would be documented and addressed accordingly. That kind of language has a particular effect on entitled people. It does not fight them. It removes the room where they normally perform. If the letter had sounded hurt, Corey would have known what to do with it. He could have mocked it, minimized it, called me dramatic, passed it to Siobhan and laughed at the parts where emotion had shown its hand. But procedure gives people like him nothing to swing at. A finished tone is a terrifying thing when your whole life has been built on the belief that every situation can still be turned by charm, pressure, volume, or blood. So he read it again. Slower this time. And the deeper he went, the less it looked like punishment over one argument, and the more it looked like something much worse for him. A pattern he had not noticed had already been named. The letter did not say he was being cut off because of a single disagreement. It said, in clear and measured language, that this action followed a documented course of coercive financial pressure, culminating in abusive conduct on a recent date now preserved in witness-supported form. Not gossip, not family retelling. Documented, witness-supported, preserved. That was the line that would have changed the temperature in the room around him. Because that was the line that told him the spit was no longer his private ugliness, it was evidence. I can imagine the moment his eyes went back over that part. The second pass, maybe the third. The way his mouth would have tightened when he realized some other person had seen enough, heard enough, signed enough. The way memory probably rushed back to him then, not as something he regretted morally, but as something he had failed to contain. That is always the more frightening realization for people like Corey. Not I should not have done it, but I should not have left proof. By the final page, whatever certainty had carried him through the last few weeks would have started slipping at the edges, not all at once. That kind of collapse rarely happens in one clean drop. It spreads, first through the chest, then through the jaw, then into the hands. He would have gone back to the first page, then forward again, looking for some emotional weakness in the language, some exaggeration he could attack, some opening that still let him believe this was only my anger dressed in legal paper. But every page kept telling him the same thing in a different form. This was finished before he ever opened the envelope. He turned the pages again and again, and one realization began moving through him with the slow certainty of cold water finding every crack. Nothing was where he thought it was. Panic does not always begin with noise. Sometimes it begins with a man going still. Corey didn't call me first. He sat with the letter. That part I am certain of. Because a man like him does not react until he decides what the situation is supposed to be, and for a moment, he didn't know. The envelope lay open. Pages spread. Language that did not sound like me, but carried my decisions in a form he could not talk over. He would have read it once. Then again, no moment where everything collapsed at once. Just a pause. A small one. Where something he expected to still be open wasn't. Nothing missing. Nothing hidden. Just different. Title hadn't disappeared. It had moved. Not away from me. Away from assumption. That distinction matters more than people think. He would have checked again. Slower this time. Looking for the mistake. Then the next layer. The business side. The places where familiarity used to do the work structure should have been doing all along. That's where it tightened. Not aggressively. Just enough to stop responding to him the way it used to. Terms where there used to be access. Oversight where there used to be comfort. Names where there used to be understanding. That is the point where most people reach for explanation. She's upset. This is temporary. This can be undone. That kind of thinking doesn't come from truth. It comes from habit. But habit doesn't move paper. So he moved faster. Checked again. Called once. Then stopped himself before saying too much. Because asking directly would have forced an answer he wasn't ready to hear, so he circled instead. trying to confirm it without naming it. But structure doesn't soften when you approach it carefully. It holds. And the more it holds, the quieter a man becomes. By the time he reached the accounts, the pattern had already closed around him. Nothing had been taken. That would have been easier to argue with. Nothing had been erased. That would have given him something to accuse. What changed was control. And control feels like ownership to people who have been close to it long enough, until it doesn't. That's when the pace shifts. Confidence thins. Reading slows. Then repeats. Looking for gaps. Looking for anything that still bends. But nothing bent. Because what he was facing wasn't a reaction. It was completion. I hadn't changed things in response to him. I had finished something that had already been moving before he lost control in my living room. That's what unsettles people most. Not loss. Correction. Because correction forces a question pride has been avoiding. What was actually mine? By then, the language in that letter would have started sounding different to him. Not distant. Precise. Conditions. Oversight. Defined roles. Defined limits. Words that don't care how someone feels about them. And sitting behind all of it, structure that did not recognize his tone, did not respond to pressure, did not adjust for familiarity. That was the part he couldn't move. The reimbursement section would have landed there. Not dramatic. Not large enough to feel like punishment. Just exact, tied to his own words. His own acknowledgement. Nothing added. Nothing stretched. That kind of restraint does something louder than anger ever could. It removes the fight. There was nothing to argue with. Only something to stand inside. By the time evening settled, I imagine he stopped moving as much. Not because he understood everything. Because he had run out of ways to make it smaller. No loose doors left. No assumptions left unchallenged. No space where attitude could still pretend to be a claim. And for the first time, what he was looking at did not need my voice to hold. It held on its own. That was the point where anger stopped working. Up until then, Corey still had something to stand on. Pride. Pride can carry a man further than sense ever will. It can keep his voice steady when his position isn't. It can make pressure sound like authority and panic sound like control. But pride has limits, and paper does not. By the time he finished checking, really checking, there was nothing left for it to hold on to. Not because everything disappeared, because nothing moved. That's what broke it. Not loss. Stillness. Answers that didn't change no matter how many times he went back over them. That is where the shift begins. Not in shouting. In silence. He called Siobhan first. Not immediately, but soon enough. Because men like Corey don't sit alone with that kind of realization. They reach for someone who believed the earlier version with them. The easier version. I don't imagine he told her everything. Not at first. He would have framed it. Kept his voice level. This is aggressive. This is technical. She's overreacting. Trying to make it sound like something that could still be managed. Something that just needed time. But fear doesn't stay contained. It shows itself in small places. A pause that comes too early. A sentence that doesn't land clean. A shift in tone that wasn't there before. Siobhan would have heard it. Not the details. The difference. And that is enough. Because once confidence cracks, everything built on it starts to feel different. Plans don't sound like plans anymore. They sound exposed. That surgery conversation that once felt like progress would have started to sit differently in that room. Not ambitious. Not strategic. Just dependent. He didn't stay on that call long. Men like Corey don't stay where they feel themselves slipping. They move. So he reached for something easier. Friends. The kind who fill space quickly and leave nothing behind. She can't really do that. This is just pressure. She'll calm down. That kind of noise. It helped for a moment. It always does. But noise fades. Paper doesn't. So when the calls ended, he was still sitting with the same problem. Nothing had changed. That's when he moved again. This time, toward people who don't answer with comfort. People who listen and then ask. Professionals. And the questions came differently there. Not emotional. Not flexible. Direct. Were those transfers gifts or loans? Did you ever acknowledge repayment? Was there a witness? What exactly happened in that house? Find. That is when the real shift happens. Not fear. Recognition. His problem wasn't just money. It was exposure. Money can be worked around. Pressure can be redirected. But once behavior is documented, once it exists somewhere that doesn't forget, you are no longer negotiating. You are being described. That is what unsettles men like Corey. Not consequence. Definition. Because definition does not move. It waits. And the longer it waits, the less room there is to be anything else. By then, the messages started coming. At first, they still carried what pride had left. You're doing too much. Then blame. Somebody is in your ear making this worse. Then something sharper. This is embarrassing. It didn't have to go this far. I read them. All of them. I did not answer, because response would have given him something to work with. Silence gave him nothing. Hours passed. And tone, when it has nowhere left to stand, begins to fall apart. Can we talk? Please answer me. I need to fix this. That word stayed with me. Fix. Not understand. Not take responsibility. Fix. Like consequence was a mistake that could be corrected. Like we were still inside something that could be negotiated back into comfort. We weren't. Near dawn, my phone rang. I looked at his name on the screen longer than I needed to. Not because I was deciding, because I understood what that call meant. By the time he dialed, whatever version of control he had been holding on to was already gone. I answered, and the voice on the other end wasn't a son trying to argue anymore. It was a man who had finally run out of places to stand. When I answered that call, I did not say hello right away. I let the silence reach him first. It worked faster than words ever could. Corey started talking into that quiet with the breathless urgency of somebody who had spent the whole night trying and failing to arrange his own behavior into something less ugly than it was. He spoke too fast. Explanations kept running into each other before they could even stand up straight. Ma, listen to me. I was upset. I didn't mean it like that. The letter went too far. This whole thing with the reimbursement claim is unfair. Family should not be handling things like this through lawyers. People make mistakes. I can fix this. I'm trying to fix this. I stayed still in my chair and looked out through the morning light gathering over the back lawn. His voice was different now. Smaller, though he was trying to hide it. The confidence from before had burned off, and beneath everything he said was the same old assumption dressed in new fear, that if he could just reach the right emotional note, I would return to being a mother in the way he preferred. Soft first, practical later, heard enough to listen, loving enough to interrupt consequence. He did not understand yet that he was too late for that version of me. Dorinda, please say something. So I did. You didn't lose access when I said no, I told him. You lost it when you showed me what you believed I was for. The line sat between us. No shouting followed it. No argument from me. Just the sound of him breathing harder on the other end like he had run into a wall he had not expected to be there. That's not fair, he said, and now his voice had started to break in places he could not control. That's not what this was. I was angry. I was upset. I never thought you would actually do all this. There it was. Not regret for what he had done. Shock that I had finally answered it properly. I lowered my eyes to the edge of the desk and traced one finger along the wood grain. When I spoke again, my voice came out calmer than I felt. He saw this coming. Silence. Not the silence from the beginning of the call. This one was confused. Searching. What? I let one beat pass. My attorney did. That landed the way truth lands when it reaches a person too late to save them. I could feel him trying to rearrange the shape of everything at once: the letter, the file, the witness, the evidence. The timing. He had thought this was punishment assembled in anger after the fact. What he was hearing now was worse for him. Protection had been building before he ever lost control in my foyer. I had not been waiting to destroy him. I had been waiting to know whether destruction needed to be prevented. He answered that question himself. "Please," he said then, and I heard the first real crack in him. "Please let me talk to Selena. I need to explain this. I need to talk to her directly." I leaned back in my chair. "You already are." I had asked Selena to be with me that morning, not beside me for comfort, beside me for completion. She sat across from my desk in a dark suit with a legal pad open on her knee, listening without expression, prepared exactly because she understood something Corey never had. People like him treat access as negotiation until process removes that option from them. I handed her the phone. She took it, greeted him by name, and began speaking in that calm, professional tone that gives panic nowhere useful to go. She did not raise her voice. She did not scold him. She simply continued the structure he could no longer charm, pressure, or cry his way around. I set my hands in my lap, stood up quietly, and walked out of the room before the call was over. For the first time in years, my son's panic no longer had the power to call me back. Time does what drama cannot. It clarifies. In the weeks that followed, the noise around Corey's life did not disappear all at once. It thinned. Slowly. The calls he used to make stopped coming as often. The tone in the few that remained changed before the words did. There is a way people begin speaking while already knowing they are not. Things they had spoken about so confidently had to be postponed, then adjusted, then slowly set aside without ceremony. Money they had been leaning toward in their minds never arrived, because it had never been theirs to lean on. That kind of correction does not show on the outside, but it settles into a home. It changes how people speak across a kitchen table. It changes what gets blamed at night when there is no one else to hear it. It changes the way a future sounds when it is no longer supported by assumption. I did not need anyone to report it to me. Some things carry their own weight. Siobhan was still there, as far as I knew. But presence and certainty are not the same thing. Whatever confidence had once lived between them, built on plans, image, and what they believed was coming, had started to thin under the strain of delay, pressure, and the quiet embarrassment of having to adjust to something smaller than what they had already imagined. That kind of shift does not shout. It lingers. Family changed too. That part rarely gets named, but it matters. People who had once laughed at his sharpness began listening differently, more carefully, more distantly. Not because I told them anything. I didn't. I never needed to. But tone travels. Respect shifts. And once people understand that something was not a misunderstanding but a pattern, they begin adjusting without announcing it. Invitations become less frequent. Conversations become shorter. A man notices that kind of change long before anyone says it out loud. My own life did not become joyful. That is not how it works. It became quieter, cleaner. There is peace in a door you no longer feel the need to check twice. There is peace in paperwork that says what your softness used to leave open. Bills stayed paid. The house stayed mine, not just in feeling, but in fact. Selena kept everything formal, exactly as I asked. Nothing drifted back into easy language. Nothing softened itself just because blood wanted another chance to feel familiar. If I gave because I chose to. If I did not, I slept anyway. That may have been the strangest part. Rest came back before joy did. I did not celebrate Corey's discomfort. That would have made me smaller than the lesson. But I did feel the absence of something I had carried for a long time. The constant readiness. The quiet tension. The expectation that I would always have to step in. That was gone. And in its place was something I had not realized I had been missing: space. I still prayed for him. That did not stop. I still said his name in the quiet places where mothers go when nobody is watching us carry what love leaves behind. That did not stop either. And sometimes less often than before, but still I would reach for my phone out of habit, not to send anything. Just to check. Those moments passed, but they left something behind. Grief does not disappear just because a boundary is correct. It stays, just in a different shape. I did not lose my son, but I lost the version of him I had been protecting long after it stopped being real. There is no clean way to hold that. There was no shortcut to reconciliation. No sudden apology that reset everything. No moment where pain arranged itself into something easier to accept. If Corey ever changes, it will not come through words. It will come through time, through behavior, through the kind of consistency nobody has to ask for. Not because I need to punish him, because anything less would look too much like what came before, and I am not going back to that. My final victory was never that he called, or that he asked, or even that he understood. It was quieter than that. It was the moment I realized I no longer needed any of those things to feel settled. I looked around my house one evening, not for inspection, not for reassurance, just looking, and felt something unfamiliar. Sit where tension used to be. Not joy, not relief. Something steadier. Something that did not ask anything from anyone else. The structure held. And for the first time in a long time, it held me too.